into third person, and also what it means to close read text, where you're not just looking at the idea, you're looking at the language that's being used. And so that's what this whole unit is all about. We're looking at those choices that were taken when constructing meaning, because that has that wonderful ability to persuade people sometimes without them even realizing it. And the word we have for that field of study is rhetoric. So rhetoric isn't just persuasion, it's the art of persuasion. It's the different tools that we use when we're trying to persuade. And sometimes we use them consciously, and sometimes we use them unconsciously. And so this has a generally negative connotation. We talked about connotation with the lecture last week. Connotation is kind of that invisible backpack that any word has. Whether it's be something that's positive or be something negative or something that reminds you of something else. But rhetoric is generally used in a fairly negative context. So I just went on Google News this morning and I typed in rhetoric, and literally everything that came up, this is just one page out of hundreds, showed rhetoric in a pretty negative light. So we have Trump's rhetoric over this past weekend makes us weaker, toughens this rhetoric, hostile state, law and order rhetoric, protests, a guide to understanding the genius of Trump's dangerous rhetoric. We see dangerous prefacing rhetoric quite a lot, but because persuasion is kind of a neutral word, but when somebody is trying to persuade another person, people often see that as a bad thing, that you're being manipulative. And so it's taken on that kind of connotation, when really, I mean, everything we do is persuading, persuading people to take us seriously, persuading people to, care about us, persuading people to accept us, or, to understand our point of view. So it's not always somebody trying to lie and manipulate others, but of course some is. And so many of us may have been introduced to the term rhetoric from rhetorical question, which makes sense. So rhetorical question is a rhetorical device, and it's when you're asking a question and you don't expect an answer. And so the purpose of asking that question is to persuade somebody. So one that I use in my class sometimes when we're in the classroom is, so we all did the reading, right? And that's when I can tell students haven't done the reading. And so there's kind of a subtle mocking that comes in there. But I'm not expecting them to say like, yes, we did the reading, or like, nope, you're right, you caught us. The purpose of asking that question is for people to kind of squirm and get uncomfortable and feel a little convicted. And so some people will laugh and say like, yep, and a lot of people will just stay quiet. But the purpose is to persuade people to read next time, showing them, look, I do know what you're doing, and I can tell when you don't read. And I think even if you want to distance for a little bit from what's going on with the protests, rhetoric is coming up a lot when connected to COVID. The way that people talk about COVID, the way that doctors or the way politicians are communicating, the way that the CDC communicates to people, the way that IVC communicates to their students about what's being handled. So these are all sort of older screenshots, but there's a bunch of articles that were up this morning about it too. And usually it's, again, negative. Rhetoric fueling panic, anti-China coronavirus rhetoric costing lives, rich versus poor rhetoric, invisible enemy rhetoric still uses something negative because it implies a lack of action, that they're just empty words, which is an important division of a rhetoric without action is not great. Your rhetoric should be truthful. Your rhetoric should be, I hope, aiming to help people rather than hurt them, or rather than lying. So we're going to be examining rhetoric over the next 2.5 weeks. Well, actually, till the end of the semester, but just the basics of formalized rhetoric. We'll be studying over the next 2.5 weeks, looking at just the rhetorical triangle this week, and then rhetorical strategies next week. And even though rhetoric has been around forever, I'm talking about formalized rhetoric, where there started to be a system, a documented system around rhetoric. So you could go back to biblical times, to Egypt, Mesopotamia, and there's evidence of rhetoric, of this being a value in societies, that you should be able to speak and write well so that you can persuade others. It's just sort of the value of society, but we associate rhetoric more specifically with ancient Greece in the 6th century, which is where a very important political movement started, which I hope you instantly thought of democracy, because that's what it is. And one of the big things, of course, that makes democracy different from oligarchy or monarchy or anything like that is that the people have a voice. And granted, this is 6th century BC. When we say people having a voice, that of course doesn't mean women. That of course doesn't mean slaves. That only means men who had completed sort of their military training, and they had to be citizens and. So it was about like 30% of the population. So not really everybody, but still, it was different from before, because what happened is they broke up the power of the nobility by organizing people by where they live, neighborhoods, versus money. And so it ended up not being, one district didn't have more authority than the other. There's plenty to criticize early democracy for, but in theory, it's what facilitated organized rhetoric. And no doubt you've studied, at least on a surface level, sort of the different, the structure of Athenian government. But most importantly is this purple box up here, the ecclesia. And my Greek pronunciation is very poor, so forgive me. So the ecclesia, anybody could be in there. You could volunteer to. Sometimes it was soft mandated. But in the ecclesia, anybody from the ecclesias could show up to the pnyx where they met and give a speech. They could also pass laws, which would have to be written and then obviously voted on. And there would be this one person who was the citizen initiator from the ecclesia. And in the Greek, it's, oh man, I just like how this looks. I think it's, poulemenos. I don't know, man. But that translates to anyone who wishes. So it's that person who steps up and advocates. And so because of that, we're coming from a system where it was really just people who had money who were able to be educated. So all of a sudden, there's this need for people in their districts to become educated in a way that it wasn't really necessary before. If you were a fishmonger or you were a fisherman, and you would just go out on your boat before and then sell the fish at the market, like you don't really need to persuade people other than to persuade them, I guess, that the fish is fresh and good. But now you have to literally put things in writing, and that's a great responsibility because the choices that you make and the skills that you have could mean that more resources are directed towards your community, or it could mean that if there's been some sort of a crime, it's more likely to be prosecuted if you're able to advocate for your community in that way. And so, kind of like basic supply and demand-ish, when people are demanding something, it pops up. And so all of these little schools started to appear all over Athens and the cities just outside of Athens. And these were run mainly by the sophists. And the sophists were the first rhetorical group. And they would go from city to city, neighborhood to neighborhood, and sort of dramatically teach in the streets and try to get students. And they were teaching just sort of that negative connotation that people have of rhetoric, like, hey, you want to learn how to win? I can help you win. You can totally lie and win, and you can make other people's arguments weaker, and you can make your weak argument stronger. And so it didn't really sit well with people because it was a lot of just like, so you're just lying. But it was a skill that people wanted to learn badly, and it worked. People were able to study under the sophists and then go to the pnyx and push laws through or advocate for something or other. So these are like sort of the basic origins, and then I just want to highlight 3 or 4-ish people who were important to getting rhetoric to where it is today. So reacting to the sophists was Plato, and I've hopefully heard of him at some point or another. So Plato hated the sophists, and he hated rhetoric. He thought that it was just dangerous for those same reasons of like, yeah, but like this isn't true. And Plato I'm no friend of Plato. I think he's kind of an asshole. He just would like sit around and he talk about like idealized things, and he thought that the whole government should be run by philosopher kings, and he annoys me. I'm annoyed reading him, and he's very all or nothing. But his thing is truth. Truth is more important than anything else in the whole world for him. And he didn't like them because their purpose was to win only regardless of truth. And he also had sort of a personal vendetta too, because they ended up convicting, not the sophists, but people who were informed by sophists ended up convicting and assassinating Socrates, who was really the first intellectual martyr, and that was his BFF. So he was very sad about that. Aristotle kind of redeemed the word rhetoric, and he said, look, it's neutral. Like, yeah, you can use it really poorly, and you can use it just to win, or you could use it for really great things. So we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater, as horrible as that analogy is, and I don't really know why we use it. So in that sense, he felt that it was more like the Force, or like magic in Harry Potter. It is this rhetoric itself has so much power, and then it's up to you and your intentions for it, how that ends up being used. So the Force is this thing that exists, outside of people, and it's about harnessing that power for whatever your intention is. And that education can be the thing to help you harness it, hopefully for good. And so he was the first one to end up coming up with this system and like actually writing down like, okay, here's how we can start to access this power. So his book on rhetoric is incredible. And a lot of how we write essays or how we learn to construct arguments comes from Aristotle. And it's stuff that just makes sense to us of like, yeah, I'm going to prep this, I'm going to arrange the different parts, I'm going to add some style, metaphors, things to it, and then I'm going to, deliver in a way that makes sense. But he was the first one to really write that down. And his definition, I love and I think works well for rhetoricians. The ability to see in any situation an instrument of persuasion. So seeing rhetoric as the tool, and rather than just this thing that exists outside of people. He also came up with three, at that time, the three branches of rhetoric, which this is stuff that you don't have to memorize, but I want to give some context to this. This could take us we could have a whole class on just Aristotelian rhetoric, but that would bore you guys to tears, even if I was super stoked about it. So deliberative uses sort of past and future incidents to support or oppose policies. Forensic, a word that is probably familiar to you guys from forensic science. We usually use it within civil or criminal law, and that is using past evidence or actions to justify usually some sort of legal discourse. And the last one is I'm so used to reading these and I never say them out loud. Epidictic, which is usually oratory. It's you're praising or blaming somebody. It's also called celebratory rhetoric or celebratory oratory, where you're, giving a speech pretty much about people. Obviously, these are not the ones that we use that often. There's other branches now. And lastly, Quintilian and Cicero came about, and they were like the good guys who are like, no. Actually, rhetoric is only good. It can only be used to, be eloquent and to help people. They came up with eloquentia perfecta, and this is the field of rhetoric that I teach at Loyola Marymount, because they're a Jesuit rhetoric school, or a Jesuit school, so they use Jesuit rhetoric. Anyways, I'm sure half of you fell asleep, but all of this is leading up to this weird little symbol that I put on Aristotle's forehead, which maybe looks familiar to you. Some of us have English teachers who went over some of this. Some of us took speech classes. As I mentioned in the last video, I didn't even see this until I was well into college, not even like freshman year or sophomore year. This is something that we used to teach in schools, and we don't anymore. It used to be just a very basic part of curriculum through the 16th, 17th, 18th century, 19th century, and then around the Industrial Revolution is when that started slipping. So because I can't remember if I covered this in the last video, people didn't need to sit in a room and persuade people when there was industry happening, when there were machines, when there was this rising middle class, and education took more of a backstage role, whereas the idea of being sort of more self-made and and innovations and things like that were more important. And so now we just teach it in colleges, and sometimes not even then. But this is the rhetorical triangle. This is what Aristotle came up with to explain like what makes a good argument. And we'll be basing everything we do for the rest of the semester off of this. So I'll turn to a slightly better looking one. So there's these sides with Greek words, so logos and ethos and pathos. So logos is, and even though this looks like, I think this makes it look that like this is a taller, it's not really a great, what is this, an isosceles? I didn't do very well in geometry. This side looks taller. It should be equal. The point of it is that it's equal. So logos is logic or just arguments that appeal to your brain or appeal to a sense of reason. Ethos, even though it looks like it would be ethics, it's credibility, things that appeal to your sense of authority. So you're like, oh yeah, I can trust that. I can trust that. And then pathos, which is easier to understand because if you think about the word empathy or pathetic, it has all to do with emotions or just humanity, being able to connect with something as a person. So that means using emotions, using actual quotes from a person, reminding them that they're not listening to a robot. And so I added these terms as well to show that your subject that you're speaking on or you're writing on is just as important as the audience. So it doesn't matter how well you know your topic if the audience cannot follow you. So there has to be this consideration of all three of them equally. And usually, of course, logos is going to be near the top because if you don't have a logical argument, it's not going to matter if it seems credible or not, or if you connect to it emotionally usually. So we're going to break all of these down. We're going to just look at one of them today in the next video. And then on Wednesday, we'll look at the other two. And next week, look at some of the strategies we can use to achieve this. And so this is going to help you as you write your next paper, which we're going to talk about on Wednesday as well. It's coming up quickly, but it's a fairly straightforward one. And then for the last paper in the research assignment, you're going to be looking at my favorite, which is logical fallacies, people who make bad arguments. And so once you have an understanding of these terms of rhetorical fallacies, it gets really fun to start tearing people apart and start making your own arguments. And I think especially in the days of online trolls and just how much of our discourse is online, this is a super important skill for us if we navigate through any kind of online space.